Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on the Russian Revolution Area of Study 1. In this video I'm going to continue looking at the 1905 revolution and look at the role the workers played in the 1905 revolution. And they played quite a significant role. So let's get into it. The workers themselves were angry because they had suffered economic recession in the early 1900s. Witt's economic reforms, which had developed Russian industry, created lots and lots of jobs, which was great for peasants who needed work in the cities. When the recession hit, many of those workers lost their jobs and as a consequence were forced out onto the streets of St. Petersburg and Moscow with nothing much to do other than get angry. You can see here Witt's economic reforms worsened the recession by making Russia more reliant on foreign loans and investment, which drove up prices. They increased unemployment, as I just referred to, and workers, even before the recession hit, those workers who were working, they worked under very, very poor working conditions, dangerous conditions. Their pay wasn't great, certainly better and more stable than they were getting as peasants, but it wasn't very good, and they also worked very, very long hours. One of the demands in Father Gapon's petition is for an 8-hour working day. Most workers were working far longer than 8 hours a day. So as a consequence of these factors, the workers rose up and revolted. The first revolt started at the Putilov Steelworks in early January 1905, and then that contributed to Father Gapon's march with the protesters upon the Winter Palace, which then resulted in Bloody Sunday on the 22nd of January 1905, where many of the marchers were shot by the Tsarist police. The Tsar himself wasn't even in the Winter Palace. He was out of St. Petersburg at the time, but that didn't stop him from being blamed for what occurred. So Father Gapon led the march, and with the marches he intended to take a petition to the Tsar which had various demands in it. Those demands included an end to the war, the Russo-Japanese War, the creation of a constitutional assembly, increased civil liberties, and better working conditions, as I was referring to before. So like that demand for an 8-hour working day. This demand, the other key demand there obviously was the demand for a constitutional assembly with lawmaking powers, which many of the other revolutionary groups at this time also demanded. As a consequence of the workers being massacred, the Tsar himself lost his image as the little father. He lost his image as being divinely appointed by God to rule the Russian people. This process was a process of desacralization, where he was no longer seen as being sacred or divinely appointed, and as a consequence he lost credibility as a leader as well. And here is just a good stat from Richard Pipes, and he writes, in the wake of Bloody Sunday, protest meetings took place throughout Russia. The workers responded with strikes. In January 1905, over 400,000 workers laid down their tools. It was the greatest strike action in Russian history until that time. So that 400,000 workers striking in January 1905, that can be a good stat you can use in your responses on the exam or in SACs. Okay, let's just have a look at a historical interpretation now. And it is from E.H. Carr. And he writes, the three strands of the revolutionary movement, the liberals, the workers and the peasants, were never woven together, and the revolution was easily put down at the cost of some largely unreal constitutional concessions. What he is alluding to there, where he refers to the largely unreal constitutional concessions, are those promises that were made in the October Manifesto by the Tsar to create, most significantly, a legislative Duma, a legislative assembly, a parliament with law-making powers, which we know the Tsar then broke that promise with the fundamental laws in April 1906, when he said only he himself could create laws. Okay, I've got a few more points to go on with about the workers and the workers' revolt, so let's continue with that. So, one of the key consequences of the 1905 revolution was the creation of the Soviets, and the first Soviet was formed at Ivanovo, east of Moscow, in May 1905. We need to understand that the Soviets themselves are a spontaneous popular creation. They are simply a council of people who get together in order to govern themselves, pretty much in a power vacuum that was occurring at this time in 1905. So Soviets themselves, they are a creation of the people, and they obviously later on in October 1905 they play we'll see in a sec, they play a very big role in the 1905 revolution, but they also play a very, very significant role in the February 1917 revolution, and then right on through to the October 1917 revolution, which we will look at. Okay, so the most famous of all the Soviets was the St. Petersburg Soviet, and it was established on the 27th of October 1905. It was initially led by Trotsky, and it was dominated by the Mensheviks. Trotsky was a Menshevik at this time, and Trotsky is one of the key leaders who did play a very significant role in the 1905 revolution, far more than what Lenin did or the Bolsheviks did, for example. The St. Petersburg Soviet, it directed the general strike, and it led other Soviets. Particularly, it took over or directed the general strike later in the year, after the Union of Unions and the Liberals pulled out. So the general strike itself, it ran from October to December 1905. It began with print workers, then railway workers, and spread to government workers in St. Petersburg and Moscow. It was initially led by the Union of Unions, but then when they were appeased by the Tsar's issuing of the October Manifesto, the St. Petersburg Soviet, led the general strike. As a consequence of the general strike, the economy and government apparatus came to a standstill. It greatly contributed to the Tsar issuing the October Manifesto and making that promise of creating a legislative assembly. And the Tsar was unable to stop the general strike because by this stage, by October 1905, there had been a number of mutinies throughout the military, and the Tsar didn't trust that he could actually control, or he didn't trust the military to go in and put down the revolutionaries. He feared that if he did send in the army, that they would then join the revolution. So that is a summary of the role that the workers played in the 1905 revolution. I've just got one more historical interpretation up here, and it's a really good one, and it is from Orlando Figes. And he writes, the Mensheviks dominated the Petersburg Soviet. They saw it as the embodiment of their ideology. The Bolsheviks, by contrast, were mistrustful of working class initiatives and hostile to the idea of the Soviet as an independent workers' council, although this no doubt had something to do with the fact that they themselves have very little influence over it. Not even Lenin, who returned from exile in early November, got to speak to the Soviet, although there is still a desk in the building that housed the Workers' Council with a plaque on it claiming that he did. So Figes makes a couple of important points here. First one is about the role of the Mensheviks. So the Mensheviks dominated the St. Petersburg Soviet. Trotsky, being a Menshevik at this time, dominated it as well. But that's a great point. If you need to have some points about how the Mensheviks contributed to the revolution, well, there is one straight there. And the other key point that Orlando Figes makes is that he identifies that the Bolsheviks didn't like the Soviets at this point in 1905. We will see, though, by 1917, Lenin understands and the Bolsheviks realise that in order for them to get into power, they need to gain control over the Soviets. But that is for a future video. Anyway, I hope you have found this video on the Russian 1905 revolution helpful for your study of the Russian Revolution, Area Study 1. And I will see you next time. Goodbye.